In this video, Karen tried to exploit the death of my father. Want to speak to my manager? I hope you like roles. And entitled mom can't accept that her 3-year-old child isn't a prodigy. Karen tried to exploit the death of my father. This happened in 2009, but I need to give some backstory for context. At the end of 2007, when I was 17, I suffered a spinal cord injury and brain injury from my mistake. I spent most of 2008 in the hospital for rehabilitation, and my dad, my hero, was with me the whole time. He chose my life over the opposite wishes of my mother when I was in a coma. He fed me when I couldn't do it on my own. He cried with me when I couldn't understand why my legs wouldn't work anymore. He helped me through all the trials and tribulations of rehabilitation. He was there through thick and thin, and I owe him so much. Even now, 11 years after his death, I wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for his love and support throughout my life. My mother is a neglectful, narcissistic, and abusive person. My dad put his life on hold for me when I had my accident, which included his passion of flying. He was a skilled and experienced pilot, flying small planes and gliders for many years, before purchasing his own ultralight plane in 2007, similar to a glider but without a roof. Around the middle of 2007, he began to build his own house in a large property just out of town. He worked in construction and knew how to build houses, and had friends and family helping him finish build the house while I was in the hospital in 2008. At the end of 2008, the house was finished and I moved there to live with my dad. I'd been living on my own and working full-time at a local supermarket before my accident, so going from 100% independence to needing full-time care was a hard adjustment for me to make. But Dad was with me and helped me through it. I'm not sure I would have gotten through it without him. In retrospect, I never knew what I had until it was taken away, like Dad's laugh or his uncanny ability of lighting up a room just by being there. 2009 was one of the hardest years of my life, having to adjust to a life I'd never known before, a life in a wheelchair. My dad still had to work, so he would hire a live-in support worker to stay with me while he went away for work. Because he worked in construction, most of his work was around the state, which meant he had to travel for work. There were 3 different support workers that were hired, but the one relevant to this story was Julie, who was recommended to us by someone in the family. Julie was the support worker that stayed for longer, but was the one that I didn't get along with. Our personalities didn't mesh well together, but I just went along with it, knowing that Dad had to work. In the middle of 2009, Julie suggested that I submit my story in a magazine, a well-known lifestyle magazine in Australia that pays for real-life stories. I wanted to help my dad with money, so I submitted my story, and not long after submitting, it got selected. I went through the process of telling my story, which took me a few weeks to write, as I didn't have the finger dexterity and brain processing abilities that I have now. I submitted the finished story to the magazine and waited for their response. They had to edit it to fit their storytelling format. It was to be put in the Christmas edition at the end of that year. All I had to do was wait. At the start of December 2009, my sister was home for school holidays, 16 at the time, and Julie had gone home for her Christmas break. My dad and his brother, who lived a few hours away, had a work opportunity in the next state that would last 2 weeks. They both worked in construction. I wasn't able to be left on my own at the time, so my dad trusted my sister to keep an eye on me while they were gone. My dad took his ultralight plane with him so he could fly it on his days off, and also take his brother flying, as he'd never been in a plane before. There was a domestic airport in the city they were traveling to for work. When they left for work, I never got that cliche moment like in the movies with that feeling that something's gonna go wrong. They just left and all was well, with my dad calling us every night before bed to wish us a good night. On the 6th of December, he called us at around 7 p.m. to wish us a good night. He said that he was gonna take his brother flying that night. Nothing out of the ordinary. We said goodnight and said we'd talk to him tomorrow. In retrospect, I wish I'd begged him not to go flying, but dwelling on what could have been isn't gonna change a thing, which is something that's taken me many years to grasp. I spent too many years thinking of the what ifs. Then tomorrow came. At 9 a.m., my uncle, who lived about 45 minutes away, stopped by. This was out of the ordinary, as he rarely stopped by out of the blue like that. And then he said the words that still resonate in my mind: "Your dad and your uncle are dead." I wanted it to be a sick joke. This stuff only happens in movies and bad dreams, not in real life. Not to us. Not to me. They had been flying the plane and it crashed, killing them instantly as the plane hit the ground. Not out of pilot error, just simply bad luck. But it was true. As the realization sunk in, my pain flooded to the surface. Memories of him came with the tears. Him tucking me in at night when I was a kid, comforting me when I had a bad dream, telling me it'll be okay when I thought my life was over after my accident. But at that moment, I didn't think that anything would be alright again. In the week leading to the funeral, word spread about what happened, and we received many well wishes as people began to make plans to attend the funeral. A few days after their death, I received a call from the magazine. They had heard about what happened, not from the newspaper, as I'd never given them my dad's name, but from Julie. I was furious. I called her immediately to ask why she'd called and told them when it was not her place to do so. She told me that she wanted to be paid for her part of the story when it wasn't her story to tell. The most interaction they'd had was the occasional conversation regarding work and the weekly paycheck he sent her, so they were in no way close friends. I'd still intended for the story to be told, but I didn't want it to be twisted into their own narrative with the knowledge of his passing. He was my hero, and I wanted him to be perceived as such, and not have my story be twisted into a sob story about my dead dad. And I wasn't gonna profit off his death. He deserves much more than that. So I told the magazine that Julie was to have no part in the story and that it was to be written exactly as I'd originally planned. As much as they wanted to use his death to tell the story, they respected my wishes and told it as it was. Still to this day, I carry rage for what Julie tried to do. The title of the article was All for Dad. I'm in a much better place now that I've washed away the guilt and the what ifs. There's a hole in my life in which he should fill, but my pain is numbed by the fact that they didn't suffer. I miss my dad and think about him every day, but I'm thankful for the time we had together. Rest in peace, old fella. Want to speak to my manager? I hope you like rolls. Okay, this happened about 20 years ago when I was 17 and working in a major UK supermarket in a rather affluent London suburb. This was my first proper weekend job. I used to work in the bakery and it was the best section to work in a supermarket. My job was to make sure that bread and fresh cakes were well stocked and presented and test the odd donut for quality control purposes so that we can make sure there was fresh items available before we ran out, slicing fresh bread and making sure rolls were stocked and tongs were available. One busy Saturday, I was doing a quick inventory count, and when I came to the individual rolls, I saw a middle-aged lady in a large furry coat and luscious red fingernails. I didn't pay much attention to her until I saw her with a crusty roll in her manicured and bejeweled hand, giving it a squeeze. Poke her thumb through the crust and threw it back in the basket. She did it again, and when she reached in to try a third one, I piped up, "Excuse me, ma'am. Would you mind using the tongs provided, please?" She ignored me and grabbed a third roll and broke the crust, so a little louder I said, "Ma'am, please use the tongs provided." She heard me that time and glared at me and said, "I beg your pardon? Ma'am, please don't grab the rolls. Please use the tongs in the basket. Are you saying that my hands are dirty?" She then raised her voice while waving her embellished hand at me, wiggling her fingers so they sparkled as they moved. "Are you suggesting that this is filthy?" Well, knowing that folks tend not to wash their hands before using trolleys and baskets without blinking or thinking, I said, "Yes, they are. Please use the tongs." The inevitable happened. "I want to speak to your manager at once. You should learn to respect your elders and betters. I'll have your job for this insolence." So I called for the bakery manager to come on down. Bearing in mind, this was a busy Saturday. He was in his whites and wanted to know what the problem was. The woman went into a sob story on how she was testing the rolls for freshness, and I was so rude to her, telling her how her hands were filthy, a few crocodile tears here and there, and how she had never been so insulted. In a stern voice, my manager turned to me and said, "Did you say this to her?" Now, I was starting to think I did something wrong and a bit nervous. I replied, "Yes, I asked her to use the tongs. She ignored me, so I asked her again." Okay, my manager turned to the woman, said that he'll be back shortly. He needed to do something and get some paperwork. While my manager was out of earshot, the woman crowed, "See what happens when you don't know your place? I said I could have your job for this." My manager did a quick count of the rolls, muttered 224 loudly, and went into the back room. He then emerged with an industrial-sized black bin liner. He then proceeded to empty 8 large baskets of rolls into the bin liner and a label for 224 individual granary rolls, tied up the bag, handed it to her and said, "Here you are, ma'am. They're all yours." "I beg your pardon?" "The rolls, ma'am. They're all yours. You openly admitted to contaminating our stock. You ignored a member of staff when she asked you repeatedly to use the tongs. You've wasted my time. You're paying for the stock you've damaged. Good day." "What am I supposed to do with all these bloody rolls? I only wanted 2. With a dazzling customer service smile, my manager chirped, "Not my concern, ma'am. Security will escort you to the tills and make sure they're paid for. Enjoy your weekend." He then turned on his heels and went back upstairs to the bakery. The woman looked at me, then the huge bag absolutely aghast, so I did the only thing I could do, grab a random loaf of bread, take it to the bread slicer, and laugh in the back room. I saw her almost every week afterwards, always using the tongs. We wouldn't get away with that now, but easily my favorite manager in all of my years of working. Entitled mom can't accept that her 3-year-old child isn't a prodigy. I teach English to children, and while the school accepts children between 18 months and 12 years, my students are between the ages of 2 and 5. The school I work at only teaches English and has different levels based on your child's ability, where the teacher can use discretion to decide if the child can go faster or needs to slow down. Because of the coronavirus, the school also has mostly one-on-one lessons now, but because things are getting better where I am, the school also allows physical classes instead of online-only classes. I have this kid, we'll call him D. He's a 3-year-old boy with a local Chinese father and a mother who's traditionally Chinese. Where I live, English is the primary language of most people, though the command of English is a little skewed with plenty of slang. D's father could speak in Mandarin to his wife, or EM. EM, however, could not speak any English at all and was Mandarin speaking only. This is where problem number 1 is. While I'm local Chinese, I only grew up with English-speaking parents and grandparents, which meant I have almost no command of Mandarin even though I studied it as a second language for 12 years. Once I was out of school, my brain wrung out any knowledge of Mandarin like water out of a sponge. I can speak it at barely conversational level, but can't explain anything in depth. The second lesson D came for was also my first day working there. While I was briefed on EM as she'd been the one to sign D up for lessons, I was informed by my coworker that D's father would be the one dropping him off and picking him up. This was good news for me because when we let the child go at the end of the lesson, we take a few minutes to go through with the parents/guardians on what the child learned, what they did well, and what they can improve on, along with any recommendations for them like speeding up or slowing down. It's hard for me to explain any of that in Mandarin, so if D's father was the one coming to pick him up, then talking to him was simple. Unfortunately for me, that was absolutely not the case. On D's first lesson with me, EM was the one to drop him off. He's only 3 years old, so we were doing a foundation class with him where we basically teach him one letter per hour-long class, how to say and write it, what sound the letter makes, and some simple words that start with said letter. Given that that was his first time seeing me, he was almost entirely unresponsive to anything I said. He kept trying to go out and find EM, would want to open the door, and when I wouldn't because he couldn't just be running off, he'd try to shove his fingers in the gap in the door. He would not repeat after me or mimic my actions and overall didn't manage to learn much. I did manage to get him to say the 4 words that started with the letter B, but that was about all we managed to do in that hour. For all my Southeast Asian people out there, you know how our parents can be. You all also know traditional Chinese parents are even worse, and EM was just horrid. When I let D out to go back to EM, she was at first cordial, asking how he did in the class and what he learned. I explained to her that because this was D's first lesson with me, he wasn't as responsive, but he did manage to say the 4 B words taught to him. Now, during classes, we have 4 flashcards with the words they're supposed to learn, and we give these cards to the parents to keep in case they want to revise with their child at home. I prefer to give the cards to the kids to hold to reinforce that it's their responsibility to keep the cards safe. Plus, it helps them develop their motor skills when they have to hold stuff. When I gave D his flashcards, EM snatched it out of his hand and immediately pointed to the first one, Bubbles, demanding loudly for him to say the word. Since D was no longer in an environment where it was just me and him, he clammed up and wouldn't say anything. EM saw that as my failure. Cue our first terrible conversation. You already know who EM and D are, and me is. I don't need to explain that. This conversation was in Mandarin, with me speaking in broken Mandarin. As a side note, I can understand Mandarin but can't speak it. Another side note, parents aren't allowed to be in the classroom during lesson time. EM. What does this card say? D. Silence. EM. Jabbing her finger into the card. What does it say? When D doesn't respond, I get a death glare from EM. EM. Why doesn't he know how to say it? What do I pay you for? Me. Ma'am, since this was his first lesson with me, I think he was shy and we didn't manage to get far in the material today. I assure you that, EM. What do I pay you for? I sent him here so he could learn English. EM glares at D and demands that he says Bubbles again, but D is entirely clammed up and just shakes his head. Me. Look, ma'am, you need to understand that this is his first time seeing me and he's 3 years old. He was able to copy what I said during class and point at the pictures associated with words. EM, then why can't he say it? D, tell me what this card says. Me, possibly because we're no longer in a quiet environment where it's just him with a teacher. He should warm up to me soon within the next class or two and become more receptive to the lessons. I'm sorry if the class today wasn't up to your standards, but please understand, it's his first time with me. EM snorts at my comment, grabs D and stalks off. I share some words with my coworkers, mostly us bitching about EM and my mentor confirming that she was just like that during D's very first lesson at the school with her. That concluded my first time meeting EM, but oh no, we're not quite done. Now it's time for today's lesson. She was even more horrible this time. She showed up 10 minutes late, thankfully with D's father too, and released D into my care. Today, I taught him the letter C, including the words car, cat, cow, and crab. He was a lot more receptive now that I figured out that he was more into physical actions and was able to say all 4 words, plus match the words to the pictures. The class itself was fun, but releasing him to his parents was not. Since D's dad was around, I spoke to him almost exclusively. I explained to him that D was doing well and became a lot more receptive to me in my lessons, but struggled with his penmanship since he couldn't get a good grip on a crayon and had a very light touch, so his movements were shaky. I also explained that he struggled to say car sometimes since he mixed up how it sounded with cow, but D's dad was very understanding. I recommended he guide D in how to properly hold a pencil at home, and D's dad relayed all this in Mandarin to EM. EM looked pissed at me when D's dad mentioned to her my comments about D not being able to hold a crayon properly, but said nothing. The school also gives the child the activity book to bring home, and D's book today had a page with a car drawing you can cut out. My coworker had cut out the entire page so she could cut out the car itself with ease, and the car was colored in by D. EM only noticed a bit of the page that was still in the book and blew her fuse. EM, where's this page? How can you give him such a terrible book, huh? Where's the page? Why did you give my son something so terribly made? Me, ma'am, that page was cut out because there's a paper car cut out we needed to use. Here, the car's right here. I flipped the book over to the front page where D's messily colored car cutout was tucked between the cover and the first page. EM's rage subsided a little, but she gave me the nastiest death glare. EM, oh, so we couldn't even color it properly. I wonder why I'm even paying you when you can't teach D how to color a picture. Let me say, teaching children how to hold a pencil is not my job. It's the parents' duty, and if they only expect him to practice for an hour every Saturday, that's their problem. Sounds nasty, but it's true. At this point, I'm exclusively speaking to D's dad and barely even looking at EM. EM has also gone back to jabbing her finger at the flashcards, demanding that D say what the words are. EM shaking the car flashcard in D's face. Say it. Say what this word is. D is visibly stressed, clutching his toy car and staring at EM but saying nothing. I decide to intervene. Me, pointing at D's toy car in his hands. D, do you know what that is? D immediately flashes me a big grin. D, car! I clap for him and give him a high five, offering EM a smile that only makes her scowl deeper. Pretty sure her muzzle lines and crow's feet are permanent now. I also noticed that anytime EM talks, D's dad looks at her with such tiredness in his eyes, like he's regretting his marriage now. I finished explaining to D's dad on my recommendations for him to practice his penmanship at home. He thanks me, while EM grabs D's wrist and yanks him off, stalking off like she's some femme fatale. The school admin apologizes to me for even convincing EM to sign D up, saying he knew she was gonna be trouble during the sign-up process. I just say it's fine, pack up and leave. Can't believe I have to see EM every Saturday now. I hope she pulls D out, even though I love him dearly. EM is just gonna keep making trouble every single week and find some reason to throw a shitstorm.